Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Beards and Bikes, the companion piece to Beards and Cars here on the channel. And on this occasion, I'd like to give a special thank you and a shout out to the English Electric Motor Company, based on the east coast of England. They're a very significant little dealership in the UK because they specialise in electric bikes. And not just one manufacturer, there's a number of different ones. There's a very healthy little range that they've got. So if you are in the market, or if you just want to test one out, jump over there, give them a look, and I have linked them in the description where you can find directions on how to drive there anyway. But on the point of this review, I actually rode two different bikes while I was there, and I chose specifically the higher models in the ranges, the Zero SRF and this one, the Energica Eva EsseEsse9. Now there are a few different versions of the Eva in their range. There's a more recently debuted, more aggressive one. You've got the EsseEsse9, the EsseEsse9 Plus, which probably the most significant difference between those is the battery range, about twice as much. And in the case of this bike, I will get to the Zero in a couple of days, but for this one, this was, spoiler alert, my favourite of the two for the overall riding experience. And this review is not trying to convert people who are not a fan of electric bikes into suddenly liking them. That's not the point of the video. I could talk about that all day long, but that's not what you're here for. What you are here for is to know, what is this bike like? What's the value like? Is it comfortable? Is it fast? What's it like to actually live with it, to ride it? Is it a viable alternative? Or do you still need to wait for the future? Because on that point, yes, prices will come down over time as more manufacturers begin to do it. And that brings me to a very important point in any electric vehicle review, let alone a bike. And that is that I think this bike appeals to two specific groups of people, and this goes for the Zero as well. One group is if you live in or near a city or densely populated area and you commute to work a lot. A bike like this, or the Zero, is a very viable option to a person in that circumstance. The second one, somewhat ironically, is the exact opposite. Somebody who doesn't necessarily live anywhere near a city, they might work from home and not commute at all, but they love new technology, they fancy something that's fun, that's different, that's forward-thinking, and they want to be a pioneer, they want to be ahead of the curve, and they're not necessarily opposed to paying a bit of a premium to be one of the first adopters of something fresh. I would argue that these electric bikes, as well as a number of others as well, tick both of those boxes. Now, to speak first of all to the more practical side of commuting, for instance, electric bikes are currently fairly expensive. You can easily spec up this bike to about £23,000, you can spec up the Zero to a similar amount, but at the same time, you can buy one brand new for £14,000 if you make a few cutbacks on those extras. That is actually not an unrealistic price compared to, for instance, a petrol bike. And once you factor in financing, well, that all of a sudden becomes a much more viable option than you might have initially thought. And the reason why I would say that is because typically somebody who lives in a city, they commute every day, that kind of thing, they're probably not buying a bike to just get a different one next year. It's a long-term purchase for them, something that is just as much about the practicality, if not more so, than it is about how good it looks or how fun it is. It's a necessity, but at the same time, who's to say that you can't have a vehicle that fulfills a necessity, like something such as a moped would, for instance, but is more fun, bigger, more comfortable, and a more attractive vehicle at the same time? That is the crucial advantage that bikes like this have. Something which, as pretty as an MV Agusta Brutale may be, or whatever naked bike of choice is your particular favourite, it's not to say that they are bad, not by any stretch. I love many of those bikes. These, though, offer such a different experience. For instance, if you were to, for example, finance this bike for £14,000 for a base model over the course of a couple of years with the initial deposit, all that kind of stuff, well, on a month-to-month basis, you're going to be noticing a pretty huge difference in running costs compared to if you were financing an equivalent petrol bike for a similar price over a similar amount of time. Plus, you can charge up about 80 to 85% of its battery in about 20 minutes. So we are already getting to a point where these battery charge time arguments are becoming less and less valid. Plus the fact that an electric vehicle is more efficient around town than a petrol burner is almost making this argument a moot point, because it is superior. It's almost unarguable. But then, the cherry on the cake is, There's no clutch and no gears to work with, and around town that is the best thing in the world, because it's not just more fun to launch all the way up to 125 miles an hour without ever changing gear, but it's more importantly very practical. If you don't have to fiddle around in the middle of an awkward situation in the middle of London and you can just twist and go, well, why wouldn't you want that advantage? Especially when the opportunity to have not only a practical vehicle for commuting, but that can also happen to out-accelerate most of the supercars that you're going to see in London, well, that appeals to your ego, and most of us are susceptible to that. Now, on the point of this bike's spec and performance, it's impressive across the board. In some ways, it's more what you might expect from a naked bike. About 110 horsepower, for instance, doesn't sound amazing. 150 pound-feet of torque, on the other hand, well, that's a lot more juicy. The top speed is limited to 125, mostly to conserve the batteries, and because, of course, with electric vehicles, the faster you go, especially up around 150 or more, the batteries begin to generally deplete pretty quickly. It's one of the reasons why not many electric vehicles go higher than that. Teslas, for instance, so various others too. But you've got about 200 kilometers of driving range in a city from that battery pack, and on the Plus version, the SS Plus, that is double, 400 kilometers. The bike also comes with ABS, traction control, cruise control, of course regenerative braking, and on both this and the Zero that I rode as well, you can change the setup of the bike, not only in terms of the mode, sport, race, eco, all that kind of stuff, but more importantly, I would argue, stuff like regen. You can have it stronger or weaker. If you want the bike to roll off extremely quickly as soon as you let go of the throttle, put a load of power back into the battery but scrub off a ton of speed as if it has engine braking, then you can do that. If you want it to be virtually seamless with no engine braking at all, more like a turbine, well, you can do that as well. Plus, in the case of this bike, you've got a 2-year warranty on the bike itself, a 3-year warranty on the battery, and when you factor in that 14 grand base price again, it actually begins to become a far more viable and appealing option than many haters would lead you to believe. Plus, you can also factor in the £1,500 government aid on the price, at least here in the UK. You've got no emissions tax, no C-charge tax as far as I'm aware, so you're literally saving money all over the place. Then you've got the maintenance. There is far less of it. You never need to change the oil, fill up the tank, none of that. It's pads, it's tyres. That's pretty much it. The rest is under warranty. And of course you can get all kinds of daily life extras as well if you want them, like extra panniers on the back, heated grips, all that kind of stuff, even a small windshield to deflect more of the air off of you. All of these things that may not necessarily appeal to somebody who wants to go on a track day, but to somebody who actually lives in the middle of a city and needs to ride to work, they probably will appeal to you quite a bit. Now, even though I am a fan of these bikes and of electric vehicles and alternative technology overall, there are a couple of things that I want to make clear. First of all, I don't consider myself to love these vehicles for any environmental reason. To me, the emissions, I couldn't care less about that. It's just about alternative technology and alternative performance. That's why I love these. Secondly, my love for them doesn't mean that I can't acknowledge faults or issues. And there are definitely a couple of issues. For instance, these are heavier bikes, and although once you get moving, that makes no difference at all, they're actually very light on their feet. If you're maneuvering the bike at a standstill, for instance to park it, you can definitely feel the extra weight. Plus, each of the bikes that I rode, this one and the Zero, had a single, I would say, issue. Now, the issue with the Zero I'll get to in its own review, but for this one it was far more of a personal thing, and I believe that it was probably more my fault than the bike's, but that is that due to the riding gear that I was wearing, I had some, I believe textile would be the correct term, like rainproof camo style trousers, rather than leather or denim, and I found the seat on this bike to be a little bit slippery. I couldn't get the best grip to sit on the bike, so I tended to be more comfortable holding on with my feet and legs around the bike rather than just relying on the seat. As I said, I think that's probably more my choice of trousers and riding gear in general, rather than the bike's issue, but it is nonetheless something that I noticed, so it's worth pointing out. I did not have that issue at all on the Zero, so clearly the seats are different, not just in terms of the size and the shape of the seat, but even the texture, the cloth or leather in use, so it is something to note. And I actually do have more specific thoughts on how the bikes stack up directly against each other, but I want to save some of those for the actual comparison video that I make. So today we're reviewing this one. A couple of days time I'm going to be releasing my review for the Zero SRF, so of course be sure to stick around on the channel for that. And then a couple of days after that I'll be releasing the head-to-head comparison, which should be pretty interesting because even though I personally prefer this bike of the two, I believe that they both have distinct advantages over each other. Now, in terms of how this Eva felt to ride, what the performance was like, the handling, the comfort level, maybe the design for instance, my thoughts on that are actually very positive across the board. One of my favourite things about the bike is that it's chunkier, wider and heavier than the Zero, and even though for something like a track day that could be a disadvantage, let's be honest, most of us ain't going to be doing a track day on our commuter bike, and the vast majority of motorbike owners will never take it on a track day. Tons of people do, but far more people don't, and probably never will for various reasons. However, in terms of the handling, I will say that I would give the Zero the edge. It is a little bit lighter, it's a little bit narrower, and even though I said I preferred the size and weight of this bike, I preferred it for different reasons. I found it more comfortable because of that weight and smoother. And even though they're both, of course, electric, even the way they deliver their performance is not even close to the same. I'll get into the Zero more again in its own review, but this one to me was far more smooth and sophisticated in its performance. The acceleration was less frenetic and less rabid, and more what I would describe as just relentless. It just built and built faster and faster, but in a very controlled way. And after riding both bikes, I personally feel that the Zero has a little bit more of a youthful appeal to it. I could see it, for instance, being the bike of a uni student or something like that, whereas this bike, to me, would appeal to maybe a slightly older rider, somebody who's more experienced with some heavier bikes. Maybe, for instance, you might have owned like a Triumph Rocket in the past, or a Harley of some kind, maybe even a different electric bike. That to me is the kind of buyer who will love this machine because it does have that kind of meatiness, which many people don't think of an electric bike as actually having. This one does, and it definitely has more of that to me than the Zero. That doesn't necessarily mean it's quicker through corners, for instance. As I said, I would give the Zero the edge, but in daily riding conditions when you're not trying to set a lap time around your local village, of course, that doesn't matter too much. What does matter is how comfortable it is, what it feels like to ride, and also the ergonomics. How does it look? Do you like the heads-up display? That kind of stuff. And even on that front, I do prefer the Energica. I like this bike's heads-up display, I like the riding position, the seat style, even though, as I said, I was a little bit slippery on it. The handlebar setup, to me, I just liked this one more. But again, I am a taller, heavier, wider rider, so of course, that'll depend from person to person as well. If you're a very small rider, you might find this bike a little bit daunting because of the size and weight. But even then, it's not like it's a Boss Hoss or something, it's not some massive machine. It's just heavier and larger than the opposition. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts on this particular bike. I definitely think that you should check it out if you are even remotely interested in experiencing an electric bike. And not to get overly preachy, but I strongly believe that the overwhelming majority of naysayers and haters on electric vehicles, not just bikes, but cars too, are people who have never driven one. If you drive one, even if you don't buy one, I guarantee it gives performance and especially acceleration that you have never experienced before. It is relentless, it's borderline scary the first time you experience it, and it is incredible. 0 to 60 in supercar territory, but at the same time with the running costs that make a moped blush. That sounds like a pretty good deal to me. But that's it for my thoughts on the Eva EsseEsse9, and of course stick around on the channel for my review of the Zero SRF in a couple of days, and crucially, my comparison video between these two bikes to see which one is subjectively my preferred in various ways, but more importantly, which one objectively on paper is perhaps the superior choice. But until then, I'll see you next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.